Welcome to the Health Leader Forge, where today's health leaders help to forge the leaders of tomorrow. I'm your host, Mark Bonica, of the University of New Hampshire's Department of Health Management and Policy and the Northern New England Association of Healthcare Executives. Our website is healthleaderforge.org, where you can find information about subscribing to the podcast, links and information related to the episode, as well as our complete archives. Today we return to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, and our guest is the Reverend Frank Macht, the director of the Chaplaincy. Frank is a minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, although he's originally from Germany. Together we reflect on his journey, as he refers to it, and the experiences he has had as he served and trained all over the United States, from Berkley, California, to Atlanta, Georgia, to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to Nome, Alaska, and finally to Lebanon, New Hampshire. Frank was first called to the ministry as a hospital chaplain through a training program known as clinical pastoral education. His interest in this specialized form of ministry led him to become a clinical pastoral education supervisor, which allows him to supervise the clinical training of other chaplains. In this podcast, we discuss the training a hospital chaplain goes through, the role of the hospital chaplain, and specifically the role of the chaplaincy at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. I really enjoyed this interview because of Frank's unique story and how he enhanced my own understanding of the role of the hospital chaplain and chaplaincy training. I think it's important for healthcare leaders to understand what a well-trained chaplain can bring to the care team, and I think Frank does an excellent job of explaining that role. Frank and I had a lengthy conversation about his career and the role of the chaplaincy. To produce this episode, unfortunately, I had to edit out much of the conversation that was of interest to me, so I am posting two versions of the interview, the edited version and the full-length interview. You are listening to the full-length version of the interview. If you would like to listen to the edited version, please check our website, healthleaderforge.org, for the link. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Don't forget to leave us feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or wherever you may be accessing this recording. Also, you can find us on Twitter at the handle @HealthLF. That's at HEALTHLF. Thanks for listening, and here is the Reverend Frank Macht. Welcome to the Forge, Frank.
Thanks for having me today, Mark. It's exciting to see you again. I look forward to our conversation.
So listeners may notice a little bit of a different accent today. We're not going to have the usual New Hampshire accent. You're originally from Germany, and you studied theology at the universities of Frankfurt and Munster before coming to the United States. When did you know you wanted to be a minister, and what inspired you to follow that path?
Well, I actually started studying theology before I knew I wanted to be a minister. That's an often asked question, especially if you're younger and your friends here in your volleyball club, asking you, why would you want to study theology? Are you going to be a pastor in a church? And I had gotten curious about asking some of the bigger questions in life after I finished high school, and I ended up doing a civil service, instead of military service at the time. That was a choice as a conscientious objector, and I ended up serving in a church setting. Not an environment that I was particularly familiar with or had grown up with. And during that time, and also through a significant relationship, I had more questions, about maybe God and the world, so to speak. And to everybody's, and maybe even my own surprise, I told folks after I was done with this internship or civil service, to study theology. Not necessarily with the goal of being a minister, a pastor. And then people are asking, well, if you're studying this, what are you going to do with it? Uh-huh. So it has kind of been an evolving process, and I think we'll get to that as I've seen your questions a little bit later. Once I get some clinical experiences actually here in the U.S., being at the bedside with people, that sense of call, I could be a minister rather than a theologian or a teacher or maybe pursuing a PhD, kind of emerged. So it's been a gradual process, and maybe it's still growing on me.
Okay. So you did undergraduate work while you were at Frankfurt and Munster? Was this is there a U.S. equivalent of graduate school in there, or?
I believe that's changed. At the time, which is now like 25, 30 years back, when I started out, we did not have undergraduate studies. So actually this morning, as I was sitting in a class with one of your colleagues, this was the first college class I ever took, In Germany at that time, you would graduate with your Abitur from the high school, which not everybody finishes. There's a 3-tier system early on in the school system. And then you end up straight at the university, either studying medicine or law or business or theology. So there is not this kind of British model or American model of a 4-year undergraduate. I understand now, in the meantime, that's changed in the last 10, 15 years. I think there's a standardization as the world is getting smaller with international degrees. So now I'm surprised when I go back to Germany and I see younger folks and they are talking about getting bachelor's and master's degrees.
Okay.
I don't think that's the case in theology, but again, when I started out, it was a long 7, 8 years of study, but just with this specialty. And when I came to the US, I was able to transfer credits. So I actually got a master's degree or 2 in this country without having officially a bachelor's degree, which is kind of a
that is interesting. Okay, so what brought
but
you...
I put the years in the studies that I want to claim.
Right. So what brought you to the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, which is in fact where you got your Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Arts, you said? And were you ordained before you came?
I was not ordained at the time. So I was like 25 years old and in Germany and had studied theology for 5 years. And I felt kind of restless at the time, kind of a little bit on the road kind of feel. I wanted to spend a year in a foreign country. Maybe learn a different language or improve on English as I ended up in the US. But basically get a little bit out of the culture and kind of the beaten path, which is something fairly difficult for Germans to do because once you're on that track, you stay on the track. Mm-hmm. Versus here in America, I've really appreciated, that people have second careers. You can change according to your passions and start over again. This culture is much more receptive to that. But for me at that time, I wanted to spend a year in a foreign country, and when I studied in Münster, I met a professor who was a colleague of one of my professors there, who came from Berkeley, California, this particular school. He taught business ethics, kind of a subspecialty in ethics, in a seminary. And I was very interested in that topic, ethics in connection with the real world, in this sense with business settings. So here I saw my opportunity not just to go anywhere for a year in a foreign country, but after he gave a couple lectures, I asked him, what would it take for me to study with you? And it was a life-changing event, which I didn't know at the time. He got a little business card out of the admissions office of Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. So I didn't know much about Berkeley, but I looked on the map and it was Northern California and San Francisco, and that looked great. But I had a person I connected with. Mm-hmm. It was a personal relationship, and I also had a purpose. I wanted to study particularly that topic with him. And passed some English test of English as a foreign language, and ultimately a year later I came to Berkeley with the intent to be there for a year, which then turned into 4 years.
You were coming there to study the business ethics aspects.
And other theological courses, but okay. I was especially drawn to him. I had done already a lot of the so-called undergraduate work and basic New Testament, Old Testament biblical studies in Germany, so I had a lot of freedom because of the transfer of credits to kind of specialize. Okay. So I became a teaching assistant in his ethics course, Intro into Ethics, I believe, and worked closely with him. Charles McCoy, I should mention his name.
Okay, good.
He's also passed away, unfortunately, in the meantime. But he became a mentor, and what I really appreciated is the close relationship you could have with a professor here in this country, certainly from my experience, versus in Germany. That was much harder with, at that time, many more students at the larger university setting, and a little bit more. The Herr Professor, was kind of typically in his or her own sphere, versus that close side-by-side mentoring relationship or being on a first-name basis, which is so American compared to a differential culture in Europe.
Sure.
That was very moving experience and probably contributed to me then also wanting to stay, a second year. The language was getting better. There were more questions, than answers, and ultimately I finished my degrees in this country.
So while you were in Germany, you were studying theology, were you on a track that you were pretty sure you were going to be ordained at some point, or had you not made that decision?
I hadn't made that decision really at this point.
Before you came to Berkeley?
That's true. I don't think ever anybody had asked me that with respect to ordination. That came much later, after I took a semester off while in Berkeley. Okay. and entered what we'll get into is become kind of a life's calling, clinical pastoral education. So I crossed the bay from Berkley to Stanford, California, to the hospital there for about 5 months, and got some training and worked with people in a clinical setting. And that really then kind of affirmed me in my sense of wanting to work closer with people and not just pursue a PhD in the academic setting, but really serve the church and kind of people more directly. And ultimately that led to the decision then to become ordained and affiliate with a denomination, with a church, in the U.S. Once it became clear that at least I wanted to finish my studies here and get ordained in this country.
Interesting. So going back to the Pacific School of Religion, you had that connection with that professor. Mm-hmm. You decided to come over here. It was only going to be for a year in the United States, and I'm going to go back. And I looked on the Pacific School of Religion website, and the school describes itself as living a radically welcoming gospel. Can you talk about what that means?
Yes, well, I as I said, I did not come particularly to pick this school out of many other seminaries. I was not that informed about all the options in the country. The connection was made through one professor, but I did find, coming from a university setting in Germany, to be, first of all, in a seminary that is more of a community. Many reside there, live with each other. It's almost, I would say, a faith community in the sense that there are worship opportunities. It's more about living together, kind of with each other while we're studying, rather than a very academic university setting in Germany. So that was very appealing, but a Pacific School of Religion for the longest time, I would say, has a tradition of being very progressive on social issues, probably going back to being in Berkeley, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, various liberation movements that also faith group leaders and theologians were part of. And actually my mentor, Charles McCoy, remember him telling stories. He was of that generation as a young man and as a young pastor to be part of a civil rights movement. And he brought that into his teaching, certainly with an emphasis on ethics, maybe even corporate culture, and wanting to change society and transform society, to put your faith into practice, so to speak. I think as things have evolved, I think Pacific School of Religion at the time already was very inclusive, of course, of women in leadership roles, which the church, like other institutions in society, had struggled with. Ethnic diversity, being on the Pacific Rim, bringing people from, other Asian countries in particular, into leadership roles. Issues of diversity, especially with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, they're very involved and supportive, and I think have a center for GLDB studies, that has evolved over the years. Has an affiliation with the metropolitan community churches who have their faith group leaders, pastors, often trained at that seminary, which has its roots in being interdenominational, which was also very appealing for me. Coming from Germany, you're either Catholic or Protestant. Now you're in the Bay Area in California, and even with the various Christian denominations, various religions, Center for Buddhist Studies, the whole diversity piece of being in the Bay Area was very impressive for me as a fairly young guy from somewhat homogeneous culture.
Okay. And that was one of the things that struck me about the Pacific School was, at least today, they list 17 denominations of incoming students. And that just kind of surprised me, because I'm imagining training. How does one train 17 different denominations in one school for preparation for potentially for ordination? Well, or is that not the main focus?
It may not be the main focus, of course. If people are preparing for leadership as pastors, clergy, typically in their denomination, there's some classes that cater particularly to that. So, for example, I happen to be in my background and then also affiliated with a Lutheran church. I would spend a year or several classes at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is part of a consortium of denominational schools, seminaries in California, and would take classes like Introduction to Lutheranism in America, with that particular context, or policies and polity, of your denomination. And I think that's true for the Methodist Church or United Church of Christ and others. But overall, if theological studies classically focus, let's say, in the Christian tradition on the Old and the New Testament, on Scripture, on church history, on the matters of faith, matters of morality and ethics, and then practical theology, which may include preaching, pastoral care, and other subspecialties. So that certainly can be taught, and even better taught, with people from various traditions.
And it adds some richness to it.
It adds richness to it, and that's the case now. I think we'll get to that. I've become an educator myself, doing clinical training, and we have students certainly of various faith backgrounds who take part in that training. And now that you ask of it and I get to think about it, maybe being in such a diverse environment, that appreciation for that diversity carried over into my calling to be an educator in a clinical setting that brings people together from a variety of settings. I enjoyed, being pastor of a Lutheran church, yet also as a chaplain, one of the delights is, I get to work with people of various walks of life, different faith backgrounds, spiritual but not religious, and a variety of opinions. And I find that enriching and engaging in a particular way.
So I had the impression that you had finished your degree and then gone to Stanford, but what you actually said a moment ago is you took a break.
Right.
So you'd come to Pacific School to study with your mentor. You were particularly interested in ethics and some of the other things that he had introduced you to. Why the break? Why the decision to go to Stanford?
Well, like 8 and maybe 9 years of theological studies now in the classroom, and still having that question that you actually ask first is about ordination and what are you going to do with this degree? It was kind of looming, and I said, after all that theory, I need to have some practical experience. And it wasn't the time yet for an internship in the church. That came later. That's a denominational requirement, which actually got me up to Alaska for the first time. But I learned about this thing other students talked about called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, where there's a structured program where students would be in the clinical setting, typically in hospitals, and with mentorship and within a group process would experience themselves, providing pastoral care to primarily people who are in the hospital, patients, families, also staff. So for me to get out of the classroom, take a break, experience myself, in a ministry role was necessary at the time and then ultimately very formative.
Okay.
So I could say now that maybe it was providential, that I saw that announcement. Somebody had dropped out of a residency. And for practical reasons, that also meant that person, was giving up kind of a position that had a stipend associated with it. I had to think about financing myself in my second, third, fourth year in this country. So taking a semester off, at least having a small stipend for a few months, leaving the ivory tower, that was really the benefit of that decision.
So you went to Stanford for 6 months and you had your first exposure to CPE. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the general process of training and CPE training. What level of training? So there's different levels of CPE. What level did you pursue up through while you were at Stanford? Can you maybe talk a little bit about those levels?
At that time it was basically called basic and advanced. Nowadays we call it level 1 and level 2, the primary levels for CPE. So you could say one is a beginner's level, introduction to the clinical method of learning. Now if I have students, and at that time, this was my first time being in a healthcare setting in a hospital. So you learn a lot about just functioning in a hospital and finding your way around the different disciplines. So it's an acculturation process that is fairly basic and needs some attention now with new students, and which I needed to learn. Kind of sense of professionalism, you'll dress differently, than being in seminary, and you're expected, to make a difference in people's lives by being responsible, visiting with patients, in assigned areas. So that is, and then being in a clinical setting, basically being sent out there, with a short orientation period. Certainly by the end of the first week, you were out there knocking on people's doors, so to speak, and trying to begin to have meaningful relationships and trying to assess what may be helpful for people. So really the clinical aspect, the not trial by fire, but by experimentation, maybe some errors or questions unanswered that you would come back to your supervisor in your peer group for reflection, which is the other big part.
Okay.
Action and reflection, and then, you learn something, more action, more reflection. This constant back and forth of doing things, and reflecting on what you did and trying to learn what was helpful, what was less helpful.
So quick orientation, you found out, okay, this is a doctor, that's a nurse, and then you're out there. And what was it they were telling you to go out there and do? So can you give an example of, so you're told, you give a list of patients who are in the hospital and go visit these people?
Yes, right. What? It's not necessarily that we tell, now I'm in the role of training people, okay. Tell folks what to do. But essentially to begin initiating helping relationships. So you will be assigned to a clinical area, let's say on cardiology or oncology, and you're asked to visit people and to establish a relationship that's caring and trusting, and kind of begin to listen what maybe the patient's experience is like, and then to respond, in a meaningful way, so that folks may be comforted, may be able to explore, what their experience is, to create a reflective environment, to maybe respond to particular requests. Since I remember, they had this name badge there on the first day that said chaplain, and I wasn't an ordained minister, and now I had the authority and the responsibility that comes with a name tag and with a badge, and expectations that come with it. But that's part of the clinical learning, to step into the role of a minister and then see, how do people relate to you? What do they expect? Do they have preconceived notions? Just say, you may think, a chaplain's at my door. Well, they probably want to pray with me, are they going to preach to me, I've gone to church and they're trying to convert me. So those are kind of the pitfalls of chaplaincy. As we're entering a room, you don't know what the background is. You haven't read anything about the patient. Maybe a diagnosis of what brought them to the hospital, but a lot of it is by trial and error to establish relationships and kind of offer to journey with somebody while they're displaced, to say the least, maybe in great distress, maybe hopeful about, a surgery or a procedure that they have elected, and provide a meaningful companionship that may lead to exploring particular spiritual issues, or may draw upon religious practices, depending on the patient and the family and their needs.
And if you're not of the same denomination or religion, or the patient is not religious at all, how does that affect the relationship?
It doesn't really matter, because typically chaplains are assigned to these clinical areas, let's say a particular medical specialties unit, and are not assigned by denomination. There are variations in different chaplaincy departments. Sometimes, and often, the Catholic population is fairly large. It is sometimes helpful to have a Catholic priest on staff who attends to the particular sacramental needs of Catholic patients. So some hospitals may organize their spiritual care department along faith or denominational lines. The centers where I trained and where I now work at Dartmouth-Hitchcock does not do that. So if somebody requests a particular faith group, I want to see a Buddhist chaplain, we don't have one on staff, we may find somebody in the community. If somebody wants the sacrament of the sick, we do have a Catholic priest on staff. I cannot provide that. I may have a listening presence, but certainly I would get one of the fathers there to provide that ritual that he is authorized to do.
What triggers a visit from a chaplain? Is it a standing thing, or is it a serious enough illness or a request? Or
very helpful question that I think each chaplaincy department has to address, and they may be able, depending on their resources, address it differently. I would say that we, as probably most chaplaincy or spiritual care, pastoral care departments, as they're often called, are not staffed in a way that every patient would have a visit from a trained chaplain who does an assessment of the spiritual needs. That would be a wonderful goal and something maybe to work to. However, that's typically unrealistic. So we try to assess with the help of other clinical staff where the top priorities are. So if a chaplain, let's say, has a list of patients in their assigned areas, sometimes the diagnosis, sometimes the religious preference, sometimes the age or the length of stay may give us some information about a certain urgency. It's fairly limited. What rises to the top is certainly any kind of specific referral, a self-referral, a request from a patient, a family member, letting other staff or us directly know, we are here, this has happened, and we would like to have a visit from a chaplain. Then we respond immediately. We're on call 24/7. Most hospitals have that service. Particular situations like any major crisis, usually associated with death and dying, with a new diagnosis, may trigger, for the staff to think, oh, we want to have the chaplain here. This doesn't look good in the emergency department, or there is a cold flu. Everybody is working. Oh, it's nice to have the chaplain here in the background to maybe support family member while the code team, is doing what they do to save a life.
Is that a standing order? If you hear code blue, does that trigger one of your staff to go respond?
Correct. We do. We are part of the paging, the group of interdisciplinary team members who are automatically paged when there is a code blue.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That does not always, lead to some meaningful engagement in ministry, because obviously the patient is not going to be conversant. However, often with family members right there, you can imagine how distressing that is. Now suddenly, you thought your spouse or your parent was getting better, and now they are in cardiac arrest. You're waiting there. The chaplain may provide, a comforting presence. Sometimes could be a link, a little bit of communication, going in there, say, oh, we got anxious family members there. Are there any news already? I may go back and say, yes, they're all working very hard, with your family member. The doctor said, he would maybe within 15, 20 minutes come and give an update on what's happening or what needs to happen. So sometimes we're a valued link, on the team in these acute crisis situations in the ED or, let's say, a code situation.
So you were at Stanford, and you were starting to do this and learn how to do this effectively.
All right.
And you were not yet ordained. How did that affect your interactions with patients? When did patients kind of ask you, okay, what are you? And how did you explain? Well, I'm a student, or
You're learning how to explain what a chaplain does. I think now even more so than 25 years ago, more and more people may not be familiar with the word. When they hear chaplain, they think of Charlie Chaplin and often spell it that way. That comes up even in clinical documentation here and there. For some people, it means priest or pastor, because their reference point is church or synagogue or the rabbi. Chaplain, it's somebody representing a faith tradition with a particular interest. But also people who have had encounters with healthcare, they maybe have a good grasp that a chaplain essentially is there to accompany people during a crisis time or even with chronic illness, to offer a spiritual support. Or often people will think, oh yeah, chaplain is somebody I can pour my heart out, somebody who will listen, somebody who is maybe less rushed to have to do things. Physician time with patients gets shorter and shorter. Even nurses are busier and busier, also with documentation. So they say, oh yeah, I need somebody to talk to what's going on with me on the inside. And that gets pretty close, pretty quick to what a chaplain does.
Okay.
And when a chaplain, or me as an intern, way back then there in Stanford, kind of says, oh, I'm here, to journey with you, or I'm wondering what's going on with you as you're dealing with this new situation, then often that eases, patients or family members' fears about, oh, he's not here to preach to me. This is not about me going to church or, morality and some of the things that so often religion has and still is about.
Yeah. You used the phrase journey. Is that a phrase that is commonly used in the
I think it's commonly used. I like it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, people are on a journey, so to speak, in life, and when there is a healthcare crisis, either an acute event or sometimes dealing with chronic issues that kind of pop up here and there, it usually puts a journey to a halt, or there may be some changes on that journey. Those are opportune times for reflection, and often people will ask some of the bigger questions in life that you and I and others don't attend to as much when we're busy with our jobs and managing children and families and all of that. But sure enough, you had an accident and I could have died, or now I have this illness, or we're sitting here waiting for the results of something showed up on a scan. It puts a halt on the journey. But then as people are navigating maybe the new normal, yes, I will have to go to rehab. I'm losing a function of a particular aspect of my life. I, down the road, may have to go on in life on this journey without my child, my parents, a spouse. Those are opportunities, what I would say, for meaning making and renegotiating kind of life's journey and what is important. That's part of the reason I think why chaplaincy departments and also this training method, ended up being affiliated with medical centers because of the crisis nature of hospitals. The need is there and the receptivity is typically there. As well as the opportunity to reflect with somebody who also has a certain training and background to at least engage, the bigger questions in life. Not necessarily to have the answers to why did that happen to me and why now, and this is not fair, and there's so much suffering in the world, and certainly those things that come up, if you're facing, matters of life and death.
So you were in your training, and you mentioned it used to be called basic and advanced. It's now level 1 and level 2. What level did you get to during that 6-month period? Is there a clear delineation? Yes, now you're...
Not necessarily a clear delineation. At that time, probably I stayed at that basic level, and later on, after doing an internship in a church, I kind of re-entered CPE in New Mexico and Albuquerque. Then you may move to the next level, which basically is a continuation of asking more questions and developing skills to continuously engage these matters of life and death or decision making at a continuous basis. You move beyond just basic listening skills, mirroring techniques that help somebody to unburden themselves, but you learn about how to maybe ask more poignant questions or get to aspects of guiding, assisting with decision making. You learn how to self-supervise your own work. In the beginning you depend on others to give you feedback. If you're at the level 2 now or at an advanced level, like any practitioner, you're able to evaluate your own work. We do this in CP primarily with a verbatim format where students, like I did, and now I supervise the work of students, write up pastoral encounter situations with patients, families, sometimes staff.
Mm-hmm. That's called a verbatim.
It's called a verbatim because at the core really is in verbatim the encounter, the patient said this is how I responded, then this happened. And the student usually evaluates, that interaction, said, is there anything important that was said that I missed? Did I respond in a way that actually was helpful? I noticed, there was a sigh of relief, or a patient expressed some appreciation and gratitude, or you could visibly tell that was meaningful to explore. Or somebody says, well, thanks for stopping by, just to talk about it, with you helps me, now I can talk to my family members. Okay. So to be able to self-evaluate your work, because at some point you're leaving this training process and you're functioning independently as a practitioner, is really a big part of that level too. Getting to that point, you can do your own work of self-evaluating and self-supporting.
So chaplains who have achieved level 2, or the advanced level as you used to call it, actually, when they're back in practice, will sit down and write a verbatim and then review their own work.
They may do that. I wish they would all do that after they're out of the training program.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think they're not doing that consistently.
Oh, okay. But often, is that the idea, though?
That would be the ideal that at least occasionally they would do it. Okay. Or they would seek peer support.
I see.
Often our students will like this program because there is a strong peer component in there. Now near the end of the unit right now, that the students I have, 5 of them, they're saying, well, what will I do without this process? For emotional support, because often, of course, encountering these existential tensions, as I would say, in people's life, have an emotional toll. So there's a great need for support, but there's also a great need for reflecting on, what went well here. I felt like, this was kind of a dead silence and we never got anywhere. Who can I talk about this and keep on learning with, So
do your cohorts tend to form long-lasting peer mentoring arrangements, or is that a thing that
some do, but they ask about it, and I have offered, to provide in our department, certainly a space and possibly a time for them to come back.
I see.
My expectation at this point is that I can't take that responsibility on for them. They are preparing and are board-certified chaplains, so they have to take the initiative to create an environment where they keep on getting feedback from peers and offer feedback to others. So basically, develop professional practice.
Okay.
I would offer to be part of that if I'm invited, but I'm not going to organize it for them because they're not in the program anymore.
Right.
And now I'm relieved of that responsibility.
It seems like it would be a very intimate kind of experience for a relatively extended period of time. I mean, I can imagine that these must create some long-lasting friendships that, maybe would...
It does for some people stay in touch,
okay.
Especially if they're in the same area.
Okay.
I would encourage and foster it, but as you may know from other fields of practice, once you're done, you have your degree, to be faithful to this reflective process is difficult, and some of it has to do with the nature of the demands and the work. I would encourage you to take this time aside also for, it's the best part of self-care, so to speak, and staying sharp and renewed and energized in your own practice if you are with colleagues.
So you did this experience at Stanford, and this is what you said was kind of the triggering point for you to say, I do in fact want to be ordained.
I want to be ordained. I want to be in ministry. I can see myself. I really very much felt affirmed in my sense of being able to make a difference in people's lives. So it's kind of not a confidence builder, but an affirmation of that sense of calling. There's a need out there, and there's a hunger for people to have meaningful relationships and need for support during these pressing times. And if I could help with that, that essentially became my calling.
And was the attraction immediately to a hospital-based practice or ministry, or were you thinking, I'll do a church and then I'll do some of that as well?
I think it was immediately to this clinical setting as well as the education.
Okay.
However, as we continue kind of on my vocational journey, to get ordained, there are certain requirements in my denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, for good reasons. Since a call, affirmed by a church and leading towards ordination is a call to what's called the ministry of word and sacrament, which means preaching the gospel in the Christian tradition and also administering the sacraments of baptism and communion, which typically happens in a congregational setting.
Okay.
So chaplaincy, like military chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincy, prison ministry, is what's called in many denominations specialized ministry. So chaplains typically need to get endorsement from their faith group or denomination that they have the authority to function as clergy, sometimes as lay ministers in this particular ministry. I wanted to pursue this specialty. However, to get ordained, I was required to spend at least 3 years in a congregational setting and receive a call from a congregation, which is the prerequisite to get ordained.
What does it mean to receive a call from a congregation?
To receive a call from in the Lutheran Church as well as other denominations, I can't list them all, you need to have a call to ministry, typically from a congregation, from a church that calls you as their pastor. Then you get ordained. You don't get ordained by finishing your degree. Some denominations, that may be the case. You have your degree, now you're ordainable, now you apply for jobs, or you're waiting, negotiating with the church to call you as a pastor. In my tradition, as well as some others, you get your degree, Then you let your bishop or your authority know you're ready for a call. They're involved in this discernment process where it may be a good fit. And a congregation decides to hire you. Now, if this is your first call to a parish ministry, you will get ordained, in my tradition, by the bishop in that congregation or your home congregation, and then you will be installed as their pastor. So there's no ordination without a call.
Okay, so you have to convince this congregation to hire you, or is it the bishop in your case that kind of helps make that happen?
The great variations among different Christian denominations. As many folks know, in the Catholic tradition, there's a lot of authority with the hierarchy, with the bishop assigning people. I believe in the Methodist tradition, traditionally that was the case, that leadership, a superintendent would decide where people go. In my tradition, the Lutheran Church is the role of the bishop in a particular area is to be somewhat like a matchmaker. The bishop knows the different congregations and ministry settings and the needs of that church and community, their strengths. Do you need a strong administrator as a pastor there because they got a lot of lay leadership who run a lot of ministry? Are there a lot of pastoral hurts in the community, so you need somebody who's good at pastoral care? Are they drawing a lot of energy from music and the liturgy? Is there a pastor who has that skill set? So I've always appreciated that kind of the wisdom of the bishop and the larger church kind of progress a little bit. So there's a pre-selection process where the bishop will say, I got several candidates in the pool there. I looked at their profiles. I know where the openings are. I think I give this congregation these 3 candidates to consider, and then they kind of step back a little bit and the congregation goes through their own process and then may interview on the phone all 3 candidates, maybe invite 2 people like a job interview, and then at some point deliberate, prayerfully discern who may be a good match, on a pastor to partner with, in the mission and ministry of their church.
So I assume you went back to Pacific School and you finished out your degrees. You got your Master's of Divinity. And then what was your process from there towards getting your call and your ordination?
Good. Then after getting the degrees, I added a second degree in religion and society ethics, working with the professor Charles McCoy, what we talked about. So I wasn't done yet with the classwork, and that was a joint degree they offer, by just adding another year, which was helpful, since I also was not ready for a parish call yet. But then a denominational requirement, the Lutheran Church, as part of the expectation is that you do an internship, in a congregation. And that was the time for me to consider leaving, the Bay Area. I did have the sense, if I want to minister in this country, at some point you have to get out of Berkeley. This is not the norm, I needed to expose myself to a different subcontext.
Right.
And at that time, which became very influential, there were the group of students who would go on internships in a room with the big table, and all the internship profiles of congregations were there. And I did remember there were lots of congregations in Northern California, in the Pacific Northwest, and then there were 2, one in Hawaii and one in Alaska. And those 2, maybe the travel bug again, got my particular attention. I wanted to kind of see another part of the country where I hadn't grown up in. But I decided, or I thought, Hawaii is almost too nice of a place. I come from a working class background, and I'd love to visit Hawaii and have done so and enjoyed it. But basically a whole year to spend in a place that draws on sunshine and vacationers, kind of, it's almost too nice. So kind of my blue-collar background kind of was drawn to a little bit the more nitty-gritty of Alaska and the climate being different there, and a different environment that certainly was adventurous in its own way, but maybe a little bit closer to home and real people and work situations and people living, in sometimes harsh conditions. So no surprise, I was the only one who wanted to go to Alaska, and I got that opportunity, and this turned out to be, a very, very meaningful year in serving and learning, in this congregation. It ultimately led, after I returned and did more CPE, in a different setting. Later led, me having a parish call in Alaska and spending about another 14 years there in ministry.
Oh. Okay, so you did your internship in Alaska, and then you came back?
I came back for personal reasons at the time, some relationship I tried to save, which ultimately did not work. But that took me a little bit on a spin vocationally, and I, at that point in the Bay Area, decided to go back to clinical pastoral education and get maybe a third unit of training, maybe that at advanced level. Okay. I was a little disoriented about what to do next with the relationship changing and not having a clear sense and not feeling ready for a parish call. So I had experienced this educational program as a very healing place and nourishing, because of the constant action and reflection. And it was very meaningful for me yet to go to another different culture in the Southwest. I ended up in Albuquerque. Yeah. A very different population there, enjoyed it greatly, and then continued actually with a second-year residency, a full year of CPE at Emory in Atlanta, Georgia. So that was a big, long transition period already with the goal to the emerging goal to become actually a pastoral educator and what's called a CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education Supervisor.
Okay. So what level of education did you get to while you were in Albuquerque? And then were you at that point, had you achieved the supervisor level, or was that only after you went to Emory?
That was much later. Okay. So I probably in Albuquerque did another basic unit. It was in a different context, a new hospital, large Hispanic, also Native American population. So CPE really takes its learning from what's really the environment, the particular situation. The mantra is, let your patients teach you. What's your patient teaching you? The questions arising out of each context or encounter, become, your learning, and you set your own goals while there is some curriculum built. But you kind of don't know what you're learning until you're stepping into situations that you want to learn about. So for me, dealing with Albuquerque had a lot of gang violence at that time. So being on call, being in the ED, dealing with shootings and with stabbings and having large Hispanic families often there, dealing with kind of different psychosocial contexts. In that context, I could learn something about it because I was kind of called in or thrown into those situations. Yeah. Then I went, as I mentioned, for a whole year because I really fell in love with this training method. And I went to Atlanta, Georgia, again, a very different cross-cultural setting, which I'm also passionate about, being from another country and fully embracing the diversity of America, living in Berkeley and Alaska and New Mexico, and then in the South, really of all places, and ending up in New England of all places. Right. so seeing a lot and kind of being energized by that.
Yeah,
I did go to Emory in Atlanta out of all places because at that time they offered for the first time a CPE residency, a full year, 4 units of training in business and industrial chaplaincy. Right. That connected with my interest in business ethics and corporate culture and my working class background, ministering to people, at work, where many of us spent most of our waking lives. And I'd learned about this new program there that was actually attached with Emory and the hospitals, but also was in the community with the business. So I didn't have any other plans. I was without a relationship. I had nursed for some time. I could move anywhere in the country, and this was of interest, and I could go. And if that program would have been in Boston or in Seattle or in Minneapolis, I would have gone there because of that opportunity to do this training in a workplace setting.
Now, this is really an interesting idea. I was not aware of such a program. I've been aware, as we talked about CPE for some time, and I've always associated it with a hospital
healthcare settings. Yes.
But as you know, I'm a retired Army officer, and I had an opportunity to work with chaplains throughout my whole career, and not just in healthcare settings, but in every kind of unit that I was ever in, from combat units to training units. There's always a chaplain there, and so they definitely. The Army embraced that idea of a workplace a role for a chaplain in the workplace.
Right.
But it's not a thing I'm familiar with in the civilian
and business settings.
Right.
Well, maybe here at the universities, I don't know if they have a chaplain here. There's campus ministry, there are campus chaplains. We do have a whole team of those,
I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I'm just...
No, right, but that would be another setting, where sometimes a college chaplain, where folks know, there are chaplains. Prison is another area. But yes, business chaplains are not very well known. Also, there is a National Institute for Business Industrial Chaplains. There are various groups that are affiliated. There are some training programs. I've lost a little bit touch with those organizations since I ended up back in healthcare. But that was very fascinating at the time. And
what kind of issues did you work with in this workplace version of chaplaincy as opposed to healthcare?
Good. Well, I'll step back a little and tell you a little bit about the context there. This company there, Allied Holdings at the time, or Allied Systems, was and still is a car hauling business that had been established more than 60, 70 years ago by a strong Baptist family in the South and had grown to a large company with terminals, where new cars would be loaded from railheads or from ports onto these trucks that deliver cars to dealerships. That was their business, not healthcare related, kind of a subspecialties. You see them on the road, but in that company, they were very dedicated Baptists, their faith tradition, and wanted to take good care of their employees. So over the years, they had ministers in the community reach out to provide emotional, spiritual support to their employees. And at some point, they decided we were growing. We need also professionally trained chaplains. And later on, they decided if we need trained chaplains for workplace ministry, we also want to train them, and they contacted Emory, as I understand it, and for several years ran this training program where ministry students, future workplace chaplains could spend a whole year there. So this was set up where I spent half a year at their offices, kind of home offices with the management, kind of white-collar people, from the top executives, to middle management and people doing paperwork. And the other half of that time, the second 6 months there, we're at a terminal in Hapeville, just near the Atlanta airport, where blue-collar folks would essentially, from a Ford plant, pick up cars and put them on these trailers, of these rigs, and then would drive all over the country, or the region, I should say, to bring them to dealerships. So I remember, the difference is obviously people are not necessarily sick. Some people deal with healthcare issues, or mental health issues in their family at home. But a lot of the work as a chaplain, as I walked from cubicle to cubicle and office to office, checking in with people, and then also I rode along, with the blue-collar workers, is about anything related to their work life, the work stresses. Work takes up a big part of our lives. Your life, there's stuff going on, exciting things. Some things are frustrating, So just to learn about that as a student was very meaningful, but also, again, to journey with people and give them a space to reflect, what's my experience like, being in this company, having done this work, maybe wanting to advance myself, some decision making, dealing with, let's say, at the office with office dynamics. Did a little study there, kind of to learn about kind of people's family dynamics sometimes play themselves out in the work setting. So I had one department there where I kind of interviewed folks and did kind of a family systems theory, a birth order and their family of origin, and then see, how are they functioning here with each other. And it was amazing to see some of the parallels there.
So they were living out their...
some of their core relationships and their humanness. Like there was kind of a core leader who was a caretaker and took on a lot of projects, and also the emotional leads of people. How did that impact maybe their performance, Did people who were somewhat needy maybe be drawn to this particular department because their leader actually, that's what he did, at home, was a caring human being, and how did that impact? the dynamics there. So that was kind of like a little mini research project or a study, so to speak, kind of a case study, I would say. But just the work-life stresses or work-life balance, I have elder care, I have my kids, just to drop them off. Now I deal with that myself, having children, performance issues, any kind of workplace stresses, and then just managing, the demands at home. And of course, personal issues over and over again, marriage counseling, distress with, worry about teenage children, elder care issues.
One of the ways that the Army uses its chaplains in the kind of in the mode that you're talking about is like that. And one of the expectations is the chaplain feeds back kind of a organizational morale measure to the leadership. Was that an expectation in that environment? Were you kind of expected to come back and say, hey, this is kind of where the morale of the organization is, or these are the concerns? Was there any kind of, were you expected to provide that feedback, or were you just out there doing your mission?
It's more of the latter, in the sense you're doing your mission. I mean, the leadership clearly understood a chaplain can only function effectively if it's confidential. If any employee, would think, oh, this is going back to my boss,
Right.
I've share about some of my worries or fears or dissatisfaction here, that's not going to work. You're undermining your work, and your own role in the organization. Generically, would we talk about what we observed and what we see with certainly the leader of our department, our supervisor? Yes, the lead chaplain was aware, what people are worried about, some stresses in this or that department because of tensions. Okay. How he would handle that, would he give a general report? We got some opportunities to overall impact morale. I think that would be a responsible thing to do. And in a healthcare setting right now, chaplains certainly function also as a staff support. We do have an employee assistance program. We have a Live Well, Work Well program, but many of the employees also feel comfortable talking to a colleague or the staff chaplain following some critical incidents, particular losses and hurts, traumatic events. And instead of going sometimes to an office, where you sit down with a clinical mental health counselor, it may be easier to talk to a colleague you work side by side with, who also is your chaplain, just say, this was very hard, to be last night with that family when they lost their child. So there's an element of peer support, but chaplains take on that role. Sometimes now I may go back, we had some situations where I got called that's in a healthcare setting. Folks were impacted by a patient who, because of medication issues, ended up, basically choking a staff and hitting somebody. That was fairly traumatic for two of the staff, and I ended up kind of debriefing the situation, providing emotional support, reflect a little bit of what are the things that may have been triggered while they were in the situation, and also think through, well, organizationally, could we put a process in place that automatically, if something like this happens, we do a debriefing just like emergency responders or the military, I imagine, do.
Sure.
So a chaplain would have a role there in a healthcare setting, and there in this business, the chaplains had become part of the culture. People trusted, whether they were very religious, as in the South, some more religious environment. Yeah. The role of the minister has a certain esteem there, in a kind of more evangelical Christian environment. But nevertheless, people that were not of a particular faith background really trusted, that the leadership, cares enough, to have somebody employed, to basically reach out and check in with people how they're doing. So just imagine yourself here, there's this row of offices here. If you had a chaplain here for the staff to come around, every couple of weeks or so and say, hey, Mark, how's your project going, what's going well, what fuels your passion, or any frustrations you're dealing with.
Yeah.
That could mean Absolutely. A lot. It's a great value, and then you get to debrief a little bit, and if the relationship is there and something else is happening in your life, whether it's at work or at home, and to know that person, say, guess what, we got something going on at home, I worry about that. That may be the person to sit down with over a cup of coffee. And that's just part of life, because life happens, right. And to have somebody to intentionally journey with you and be available to you. I found that very meaningful, being in this role and being trusted by people as they share what's going on, in their heart and sometimes in their guts, or how their spirit is impacted. Yeah.
So you spent a year at Emory doing doing a full year. You said 4 units of CPE.
Yep.
Does that mean you were Does that mean that at that point you were officially a CPE supervisor? No, still not.
No, that's separate. It was a second-year residency with a specialty in workplace ministry. Okay. At that point, I would have been eligible to become a board-certified chaplain. However, I decided, or I was encouraged to apply for a supervisory education position, which is that third level of CPE programs, where then you train to become an educator. And that's typically a multi-year process where under supervision you learn how to supervise students. And I had connections because I'd spent time in Albuquerque at Presbyterian Hospital. They just started that training program. They informed me that it was happening and encouraged me to apply because we had the relationship. They know I loved that work, and maybe they saw the potential in me. So I didn't have any other plans of what to do after that year, so I went back to Albuquerque, started that process for a year and a half. Okay. And then actually I ran into the denominational requirement of needing to be ordained to continue in this educational process. And the requirement, was to go into a parish and serve a parish for 3 years. I had the permission of my bishop, to go that supervisory route, but then ultimately when an official vote was taken about waiving that requirement, that was denied. I had to abandon the process and then said, okay, didn't like it at the time, sure. Because I was on my path, and I had invested in a year and a half. But if that's what it's going to be, then I'll go back to Alaska, where I was assigned as a
So you received a call.
Clergy, and then I pursued and received a call, and I said, I'm not just fulfilling a 3-year requirement. I will take this seriously. Whatever is beneficial for that congregation and maybe for my ministry, I will do, and maybe later I'll return to supervisory education.
I had meant to ask you this earlier, so can you talk a little bit about the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and how you chose that particular denomination? Because I'm imagining you didn't grow up in that denomination.
Yeah, sir.
It's associated with America.
Certainly not associated with America. As I mentioned earlier, in Germany, certainly at the time, the two big faith groups essentially were Catholic and Protestant, or Evangelical, as it's called there. Okay. And there's some variations in different German regions. Some are identified clearly as Lutheran Protestant and others as Reformed tradition. Those are theological nuances. But when I came to the U.S., now there were all these other Protestant denominations. So this is typically America. You got a smorgasbord. You got options.
Right.
This is about freedom. So you got the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the UCC and other groups that I've never heard about. But ultimately, for me, theologically, but also culturally, Lutheran was close to home. I mean, sure. I had grown up in Germany, Luther's country, where the Reformation started. Personally, when I was younger, I grew up in West Germany. My family originally was from East Germany. When we would travel to see my family across the, at that point, Iron Curtain, to East Germany, we would drive by the Wartburg, which is a place Martin Luther, hid during the time of Reformation. There's a lot of cultural history and identification, with Lutheranism as the founder of that particular church, but also the Reformation. So for me, even these memories, of having that castle up there, Wartburg, on the mountain hill as a child, and having Luther's connection, and me being so far away from home and my culture and my language and my identity, that meant a lot. That was the closest to home, literally. But then also theologically, there's a strong emphasis, beginning with Luther, on grace, the foundation of kind of a religious experience rather than a works righteousness. So for me, that countered maybe also my own kind of German perfectionism at the time. And, the harder you work, the better you're off. And the more you do, and kind of this achievement driven was counterbalanced, by messages of understanding that is strongly emphasized in many Protestant churches, certainly in Lutheranism, that we live by God's grace. And that was spiritually very nourishing and provided me with much more kind of balance in my life. Counterbalancing a little bit that drive and perfectionism, which is good and gets you that far, but it also can be sapping your energy and become a detriment. So that theological foundation was very meaningful, and I would say that's been a good match for me, and hopefully I've contributed, to the church and that call.
Okay, so you received your call from Our Savior's Lutheran Church in Nome?
In Nome, Alaska, of all places. People were thinking, Frank, you are crazy. You're still single at that time. I was in my early 30s, and what are you doing to go up off the road system into Nome, Alaska, for personal reasons? But I was very interested at that time, first of all, to serve the church, that I had affiliated with, and to fulfill the requirement and then some. And again, to do so in a setting that was different and kind of, I like new things, a little bit the adventurous spirit. And as you asked earlier about the sense of call, the bishop is a big part in that. And at that time, there were about 9 congregations in Alaska that only has about 30 Lutheran congregations were open. And the bishop said, Frank, you have done all this clinical pastoral education in hospital settings. You've been around trauma a lot, you have had a lot of reflection and this training. In this congregation or in this setting and the fringes, of the Bering Sea, and also in this native community, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of abuse issues, there's a lot of alcoholism, there are a lot of accidents, there are a lot of premature deaths, there's a lot of suicide. Like many of the native communities, whether it's on reservations here in the so-called lower 48, as well as up there. So he really had some wisdom and said, knowing also, the tension and difficulties, that had impacted previous pastors who often didn't stay much longer than 3-4 years, because the high burnout rate in this kind of environment was fairly tense.
Because of those kind of stressful...
common stressors of kind of this web of alcoholism impacting almost every family, this being the norm, underlying, abuse issues, domestic violence, high rate of accidents, the suicides again. So he said, Frank, you probably can, because of that experience you have and maybe also the network of mentors and colleagues in this field, it may be easier for you to sustain yourself in there. And you love pastoral care and counseling and being with people. And then he said essentially a pastor up there functions like a community chaplain. It's... Yes,
is that different than, say, maybe in a more...
in a suburban church, the worship leadership, good preaching, working with the youth group, maybe creative worship services, visiting certainly with elders and the shut-ins in the community, Christian education, a Bible study. Those are certainly things you would expect to be within the realm of responsibilities of a pastor. But as I mentioned earlier, depending on the context, these needs shift.
Right.
So in that congregation, they had a very traditional set worship style. I didn't need to be very creative and messing around with the pews and create new experiences, but I was very interested in walking with the people and learning about what they do in the community and some of the hardships.
Yeah.
So probably a lot more of my time was spent in counseling there and supporting people with these hurts and afflictions, that they were dealing with. In that context, probably had more funerals than certainly in a suburban church with young families, including younger people because of some of the suicides, accidents that were happening there. So that requires a certain skill set that, with the bishop's wisdom, he imagined I may be a good match in that environment. And I give him a lot of thanks and kudos and say yes. He knew that the CPE and the learning that had taken place, as well as those relationships, really helped sustain me there.
You referred to the church as multicultural. What did you mean by that?
What I really mean by that is that for a Lutheran church, Lutherans are typically of German or Scandinavian descent in most parts of the country, especially in the Midwest. This congregation was predominantly Inupiaq Eskimo. So Alaska Native people, in this part Eskimo, the term self-refer, and Inupiaq was the particular tribe. So I would say 2/3, 3/4 of the congregation were Alaska Native or Inupiaq Eskimo, and the other members of the church either long-term Caucasians who had settled there some generations ago, 2-3 generations, and also a group of, let's say, typically white or at least non-native professionals who had moved there, teachers, doctors, administrators who had some of the higher paying jobs in town and had moved there, sometimes stayed, for decades, sometimes stayed a few years and then moved on. So it was fairly diverse for a Lutheran church with particularly emphasis on Native ministry, Alaska Native ministry.
What was unique about Native Alaskan ministry? Versus, at that point, you'd been to a number of different parts of the United States. So what was especially different about ministering to the Native American population? Yeah. You talked about...
Yeah, I'll have to think about it. At that point, that was my first call into a parish. So in some ways, I can't compare to being a pastor in, let's say, a suburban church or a rural congregation. But certainly looking back, I would say that the loss of the cultural identity and how that impacted the community was tremendous. White impact was around the turn of the 19th century, including, the arrival of missionaries. People embraced, the Christian faith. Certainly the elders, were the strong support of the church, and yet also native traditions had been eradicated, sometimes by those missionaries. For example, native dances were seen as something shamanic. So now, over 100 years ago, Protestant Christians don't do that. So certainly the church had its impact on native culture, but also the church provided a safe haven from some of the acculturation and the many psychosocial issues, especially, again, the alcoholism. Nome is a town, the joke there always was, has as many bars as it has churches, and they've been at odds with each other ever since. So people who want to live a somewhat healthy lifestyle, will want to get away from the bars and everything and ill that is associated with it, would often find a home within some of the churches in that community. There was a Methodist church, a Baptist church, there were others. But the Lutheran church was fairly prominent and big because, Lutheran missionaries had come to the villages in that area, so we had the largest sanctuary there, and the sanctuary, really maybe living up to its term, was the sanctuary on some of the ills of life. It was a safe haven and a space where people would come and be comforted in their grief, especially. Okay. And what was very different, to come back to your question, is that hymn singing was almost sacramental there. Church, in partnership with rural congregations, would have conferences in the spring and in the fall where members from these churches would come together and sometimes for many hours in the evenings take turns singing hymns, dedicating those hymns, let's say, to elders or to people who have passed away, or dedicating this hymn, Blessed Assurance or Amazing Grace, some of these older gospel hymns, to families who were mourning and were grieving. So what was different is dealing with grief, loss and grief, and with mourning and walking with people with trauma or being re-traumatized or accumulated grief. That was far more intense there than I would think of in a typical congregation that is more programmatic and does a lot of other things.
What would you say?
And I would add some of the tensions because of the clash of cultures, even dealing with the leaderships. You got highly educated white professionals, who have prominent positions. They have a certain idea about how things, are done somewhere else and how they are efficient and efficiency, and that's not necessarily a cultural value. Relationships count more, and authorities are different. So having to navigate, these different cultures and be a minister to both and yet hold us together, and was a challenge, I would say, and also create a learning opportunity.
What would you say were the biggest lessons that you took from that experience that affect your practice today?
There's two things. I mentioned earlier that initially I wasn't too enthused about having to interrupt my process to become an educator, going into the specialized ministry. And yet the requirement of the church, required of me to be a general practitioner. If I'm a chaplain or let's say a CP supervisor, I can use a medical term, I'm kind of a specialist, whereas a pastor of a church is like a primary care physician. You do it all, where the people live, you're with them, you get exposed to a variety of things. So for me to have had that experience and understand, at least from my experience, what congregational life is like, what are some of the hopes and the hurts of the people, and how they are drawn into community and what they need from a church and what frustrates them being a church, has been very influential, because now I'm an educator with ministry students, some of them who will become chaplains, but many who do a summer internship who will end up being parish pastors. So kind of I at least from my experience, I know what it was like for me, and I can make reference to those experiences educating students who prepare for parish ministries. In our area, since I'm up at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, in rural areas where some of the isolation, being far away from metro areas, certainly has some parallels to being in Alaska. Other lessons learned, from that particular experience is that it certainly stressed the value of thinking in systems and trying to look at the whole community while providing care for individuals. So it certainly sharpened my sense to look at some of the patterns, what is going on in people's lives and how is that connected with, let's say, the economics of a place, or with cultural issues, certainly, the disparity, race issues, disparity between the rich and the poor, educational gap. And I need to say, I was surprised after I left Alaska, when I came to the Northeast here, to beautiful New England with the white steeple churches and the farms and the hills and the forests, and it doesn't hit you in the face as much as it does in some urban areas, or maybe the poverty issues in Alaska in a native community, or if you were to drive on a reservation. You'll have to take a little closer, but it seemed to me there were actually a lot of parallels to what I had experienced and seen up there. I found myself, or still find myself, wondering, like so many these days, where's the middle class? You got the highly educated professional people who are still doing okay and trying to hang on to some of the privileges that come with education and the economic security. Also, that's not the case anymore. It was in the last generation. But reminded of a lot of people who may be descendants of the French-Canadian immigrants who came when the cotton mills, like 100 years ago, up to 50 years ago, were still strong. And then they vanished in the 70s. And there's certain issues on lifestyle things, including the alcoholism, abuse issues, that very much remind me of some of the dynamics I saw up there in the native community. There they were all together in this town, and they were very visible in the streets. Now I get a sense of that, as I'm listening to people who often live with a sense of despair, and hopelessness. That may look a little bit differently, but there are parallels there. Kind of the multi-generational, sense of loss, and we're never going to get ahead, and the combination of mental health issues and substance abuse issues and domestic violence and abuse issues that impact a fairly large segment of our population, that if you're just driving around here on a vacation, you don't see. But if you're in a medical center and you watch people coming in and see the multitude of their comorbidities, and the complexity of their life and how it impacts, their health. That was really a takeaway, and yet also a surprise when I came here, that there actually may be more similarities than differences.
So how long were you a pastor?
In Nome?
At Savior's?
At Our Savior's Lutheran Church. I was a little over 6 years.
Okay. And then did you go directly from there to Anchorage to Providence, Alaska Medical Center?
Right. And I'll give you a little background how that came about. At this time, during that 5th or 6th year, I had actually found my wife up in Nome, Alaska, of all places, and had gotten married. My wife's originally from Maine, which already gives you a hint of why we're in the Northeast, or part of the reason why we're here. And we had our first child born very prematurely. My wife went into labor during her 6 months of 24 weeks of pregnancy in Nome, and we were flown to Anchorage, ended up at Providence, the hospital. They essentially saved the life of our little daughter, Sophia, when she was born prematurely, and ended up 100 days in a neonatal intensive care unit. Wow. So we got exposed to Anchorage, but also because of her occupational therapy needs after she was discharged, we went back to Nome for another year. They provided services by flying people in from the big city, kind of once a month. But we were starting to look, maybe, our daughter will need more continuous services that only could be provided in a bigger city with healthcare resources. And at that time, then, providentially, I would say, we learned that at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, they were looking for a manager of their spiritual care department and wanted to develop a CPE program, while I had reconnected with Stanford and was becoming a CPE supervisor and pastoral educator. So they had a need for wanting to establish a program to improve the quality of their chaplaincy services. I was in state, but up in Nome, Alaska, wanting to become a supervisor, so that seemed to be a good match, and ultimately resulted in my hire and serving there also over 6 years, developing a CPE program and being back in a healthcare setting, and then also finishing my education and that third level or supervisory education that allows me now to lead CPE programs and supervise students.
You went to Providence and you established the CPE program there in 1999, and then it looks like you achieved accreditation as a freestanding CPE training center, so you were independent of Stanford in about 2010?
Right. I was not able to do that, even, to sustain myself in Nome without, I should mention, George Fitzgerald there was a main mentor of mine who took me on as a student, several thousand miles away, being in Stanford, California, and me being up in Nome, Alaska. So I would go down for supervision on a regular basis, and then later on helped establish what's called a satellite center at Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage. And yes, after a few years of work and putting a program in place, getting myself through the process, we were able to accredit a freestanding center that's, to my knowledge, still functioning up there and provides, at least one site where people can train, for chaplaincy or chaplaincy-related ministry.
Wow, that's a neat accomplishment. In 2011, you came to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. Were you hired directly into your current role as the director, or no?
No, at that time, Patrick McCoy was the director of the chaplaincy services. He retired a little over a year ago, and then I promoted to take on that position, which is similar now to the role, I had in Alaska. Yet it was actually very helpful, to kind of step out of that leadership role for at least 3 years and function as a staff chaplain and also do the supervision of the students. Okay. It was a little bit of a reprieve from the headaches that come with administration and management, and now I'm back at it. And of course, there are also opportunities that come with that to kind of create a vision for the department and align oneself with organizational goals and kind of get the creative juices flowing, being in that role. Also, I felt like I was part of that also in my supervisory role.
So what made you decide to make the jump from Alaska to New Hampshire? So your wife's from Maine. But
well, that was a big motivator. Once we decided to leave Alaska, we were looking at seeing were there any openings, near in New England, essentially, to be closer to family. At that point, we had a second daughter, 2 children, 2 girls, Sophia, who I mentioned, and Isabel. And I'm so far away from my family in Germany. Being in Alaska in the summer, there are direct flights, but otherwise it takes 24 hours to get there. Just having 2 professional parents, not having any support, not having the girls know their grandparents. So Once we left Alaska, it was clear we wanted to look in the Northeast, which again was a new environment for me, as you have heard. I like kind of doing new things, but it also was important for me now that we had children, to create a permanent environment for them. That's meaningful to me, having grown up in Germany. My parents still live in the house where I grew up. When I go home, I know where to go. And I want something like that for the children. And while we loved and then left Alaska, I sure would hope that this is the place, that they will call home, that is a good home for them, but also will call home later on in life. And it puts us closer, to family, especially my mother-in-law, who sometimes comes over and helps or just enjoys being with the girls. And it's closer to home for me, a flight from Boston to Frankfurt is much easier, especially anticipating maybe elder care, healthcare needs. I'm an only child. That's important to me that I could fly out in the evening and be there in the morning in case that's necessary. Knock on wood, it's not the case yet, but that may come. So that figured in.
Great.
And the opportunity to end up with Dartmouth-Hitchcock was particularly of interest because it is an academic teaching hospital. I was in a faith-based hospital, a Catholic hospital, which has its advantages if you're in spiritual care.
Right.
Obviously, there's strong support for kind of from a faith-based perspective. People in leadership understand the value of spiritual care. I, being also somewhat an intellectual, also very drawn to the academic side, and this is something I'm still learning about and seeing how in a teaching hospital we can integrate spiritual care even more so maybe with research, which is a growing area in our field. And I hope or certainly will be open to partnering with others to see if there's value in that, to foster multidisciplinary care and integrate spiritual care, maybe even in some research.
What is the mission of the chaplaincy department at Dartmouth-Hitchcock?
Well, I would say that the mission for us is certainly to provide good, solid emotional, spiritual support to our patients and their families, and also to our staff, patients and families when they're with us. We got kind of restructured or reorganized and now report to the Office of Patient Experience, which I think is a very wise move in the sense of leadership recognizing that the key people who are addressing emotional and spiritual needs, the chaplaincy team, actually can have, and that's well demonstrated in some research, the overall patient experience, because we listen to people what it's like, to be in the hospital, while everybody else needs to figure out what to do to get them better and help them. Our mission is certainly, to have a positive impact on patients and their experience in the hospital, not just in the sense of them being satisfied with our services, although that's great, but also, to really help them navigating healthcare, to maybe learn from their experience, to have an overall really impact on their well-being. The core emotional, spiritual need, taps into a sense of hope is one of the key tasks. Help people, sometimes with their values with respect to decision-making. We focus on helping people with the relationships and the relational aspects, of crisis in a family and people having different feelings and fears about, an illness and the impact on the family. And still, of course, at the core, the journeying with that we talked about. While patients and families are entrusted into our care, we walk with them. And a task and opportunity for chaplains is to actually take the time to sit with somebody and reflect on their experiences, or sometimes sit in silence, to be with them while they're hurting, essentially, and wondering what the future will hold or what got me into this in the first place. Other staff seem to have less and less time. Doctors consistently are dissatisfied with kind of losing that almost sacred patient-doctor relationship because of organizational, administrative needs and missing that face-to-face encounter. And chaplains, I think, can provide that. And I would say that's a big part of our mission often staff say, to really keep the patient human. because sometimes we get so distracted, with particular aspects, this organ or this cell or this particular crisis or this bug, and yes, doctors and nurses, of course, need to attend to that because that's having an impact on the whole person, but chaplains then kind of provide a kind of a big picture. We don't know much about a particular illness and what it does to the body, but we listen to what does it do to the spirit and how does it impact the whole family. So other staff members sometimes will comment that a chaplain's chart entry actually help them to really see the whole person. And that can easily get lost, So
you actually make entries into the medical?
Yes, typically professional chaplains would chart, and that's sometimes more or less read, by other professionals, certainly discharge planners, social workers. Sometimes physicians and nurses will attend to that because that's of value to kind of see in the bigger picture what's going on. Somebody may disclose something with a chaplain that they may not as readily talk about, with others.
So Dartmouth-Hitchcock has the Geisel School of Medicine, the Dartmouth School of Medicine in it. You mentioned it's an academic medical center, so
right,
there are physicians being trained at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. How does that affect your role? How does that affect the mission of the chaplaincy, and what's your role working with medical students and residents and so forth?
Mm-hmm. This has kind of evolved just for me, and I would say for our chaplaincy department over the last 2 years, and has really been an added delight, and particular interest of mine in my role as the director and also as a chaplain and an educator. About 2 years ago, we applied and did receive a grant from the George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Healthcare. That's a group led by Christina Pochalski, down at George Washington University. And this grant gave us some support and accountability with respect to leading or facilitating reflection rounds with medical students during their third year, one of the clerkships. So we had a physician, Tim Siegel, who was able to take this on as a surgeon, but also as a palliative care doctor, and he and oncology nurse practitioner and myself would co-facilitate, usually two of us, reflection rounds of medical students during their surgery clerkship. That's continued in some fashion, and we're looking at having that continue. It builds on other attempts to integrate more the humanities into medical schools. I think our medical school, as probably others in the country, are sensing, the human aspect, the personal touch is getting lost, and the relational abilities maybe of future physicians would depend more and more on technology and data, maybe getting lost. And also physicians and future physicians may be less satisfied. So there is a need and there is an attempt, to integrate the humanities into various aspects of their training. For example, an on-doctoring class, that brings peer groups of medical students from the first year together to reflect on their sense of calling and maybe their mission and their values and their experiences with patients. So I have greatly enjoyed co-facilitating these reflection rounds because for the first time really I got to hear and listen to what it's like to be a medical student, and those challenges are tremendous. From the time management to dealing with the hierarchy of the first patient encounters, dealing with delivering bad news, encountering their own vulnerability and limits when it comes to death and dying. Maybe their own sense of calling and how their own spirit is impacted by being in this demanding role as a student and learning, to become a competent physician. And to have our skill set as pastoral educators valued, we do a lot of reflection. Our training is based on experience-based learning, so to be welcomed and asked, to help the medical students who kind of navigate that part of their education has been very, very meaningful, and I would think so from the feedback of the students has been very beneficial.
You supervise 6 chaplains, and they have different religious affiliations. Mm-hmm. Is this intentional?
Very much intentional. Diversity is very important in our training process as well as in any modern, chaplaincy or spiritual care department. It fosters, learning overall. We do have 2 Catholic priests, 2 UCC ministers. That is more likely since we're in the Northeast, and that's a stronger denomination. I happen to be Lutheran. We have a Catholic chaplain, UU. So there's some diversity. We do have a student who is Buddhist. We have had students, who are Jewish. In a major metro area, you may also have a Muslim chaplain on staff in a larger hospital or in a system, or especially if the population, Muslim population is higher. So we're very open to that and encourage it, that kind of diversity.
How specialized are your chaplains? Are you all generalists, all educators? Do you have subspecialties, board certifications?
Well, they're all board-certified chaplains, primarily as generalists. So certainly when hiring or when we are thinking about bringing a new chaplain on board, since we back each other up and support each other, we want to make sure that we can send a chaplain in every area of the hospital. So that's kind of the minimum expectation, in almost every situation, whether it's working with little children or they're dying, we want somebody to be comfortable. That we can do. We do have some specialties with respect to next week. We have a new children's hospital chaplain coming on board who has extensive experience in working with pediatric situations, children and their families. That is kind of a subspecialty. The educators you're mentioning, I'm the only one right now who can educate staff. However, we since last year started training supervisors in training, so we're training future educators, and that will be their specialty, just like it is my specialty and my calling.
Okay.
There's a palliative care chaplain as well. That is a kind of a leading clinical area that is very welcoming in integrating chaplaincy into the core of their interdisciplinary work. Now there even is some attempt to offer specialization and certification for palliative care chaplains, and I think nationwide curriculums are developed, to address that particular need, and that's something we want to look at too for future students, since that's a growing field.
Do you have lay volunteers that are affiliated with providing religious or spiritual support?
Very
few.
And is
that run out of your office?
In our office, we do have Eucharistic ministers of the Catholic tradition, so they support the priests in bringing Holy Communion to Catholic patients throughout the hospital. That's the only group. Okay. We have other hospitals. When I trained at Stanford, for example, they have large groups, probably several hundred volunteers, based on various denominations, also being in a very diverse area. They have a Hindu chaplaincy, they have a Muslim chaplaincy, they have an Episcopalian chaplaincy. So in addition to the generalist, professionally trained chaplain, they have volunteer groups who visit and provide ministry to people based on their faith group and denomination. So that's possible, but I don't think we have that much of a need for that kind of ministry in our setting.
What's unique about managing chaplains?
What? You make me smile. What's unique about managing chaplains? I mean, chaplains, of course, are the delight to work with in the sense of having a strong dedication and a sense of calling. That's really at the core, of we're here to serve something larger than ourselves, however we understand that. So that dedication, is an excellent resource. Chaplains bring that to any organization and certainly to their individual work. I hardly ever have to doubt that somebody is not motivated by something larger than self-interest, And if we can help a whole organization in doing that and nourish that in others, I think that's a contribution that we can make in helping people connect, with a true sense of calling, and again, something larger of their self, however they understand it. Of course, that also for most chaplains is their primary commitment. So sometimes there is a tension or a challenge to work with organizational needs or sometimes the administrative or a business culture. Chaplains are typically motivated by high ideals and by social justice and kind of being prophets, sometimes in their own way, in their own tradition, and that's an added value. versus, dealing with the ins and out of organizational life and large business structures and the bottom line figuring into decisions. That sometimes puts chaplains with their high idealism, sometimes me also at attention. So I can identify with my colleagues, but if you're in a management role, how to navigate that, I would say that may be a unique challenge, to align, your team of chaplains with the organizational mission, which, of course, if we are here to care to the best of our abilities for everybody and promote health, would typically align also with the chaplain's vision. But the realities of business decisions, in organizational context, that sometimes it's tough for some chaplains, to live with, because it doesn't meet their ideal of justice.
How do you evaluate the effectiveness of a chaplain?
Well, that is a big theme in our field and has come to the forefront, more over the last 15, 20 years, I would say. In my previous setting, that was primarily done to patient feedback and evaluating oneself against peers all over the country with respect to patient satisfaction. In our current setting, we're not collecting that kind of data, primarily, I think, because it's more a quantitative approach, rather than measuring the effectiveness of particular clinical interventions that lead to certain outcomes. There's a lot of work to be done in our field, and my hope would be, also being in an academic teaching hospital, that we contribute to that evidence, through research in the years to come. No organization can do it on their own in this field, but for the last few years, there are national conferences on research in chaplaincy. I would think, we can contribute to that. Right now, we're certainly depending on the feedback directly, from patients, often, their stories, the value that's attributed by interdisciplinary staff. They have a good sense, what a chaplain does and how particular chaplains function. And if they ask us to come, we know they trust us that we make a difference in people's lives. So that's fairly generic, but there's a lot of room for something more systemic that's certainly evidence-based.
When we talked before, we talked about the future of spiritual care as the health system moves towards a population health model and reimbursement based on value. Mm-hmm. You had some interesting ideas about how spiritual care could be part of that movement. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that, some thoughts on that.
Yes, one of the thoughts I have, and certainly people in the field have, is about how can we further integrate spiritual care in the whole spectrum of healthcare. We've done a good job and are traditionally based with an inpatient population in the hospital. However, with movement towards maintaining the health of populations on a larger scale, the question becomes for me, how can our chaplains, also do work with and follow patients where they live, whether or not they're at the hospital or the rehab facility or a nursing home. So we're exploring with some of our students now if we can provide some of the continuity of emotional and spiritual care by chaplains, whether it starts at the hospital and follows into the community, or we have a student who resides in the community, knows people from that area. When they come to our hospital, this person sees that particular patient and the family. Because if you have to retell your story, to other caregivers and providers, you're establishing some depth, then you go to another facility or sometimes even a different unit in the hospital. In the past, we would pass on these people to a different chaplain. I would want to develop, explore, and maybe actually research, some models and see if we can do this better. Imagine you or a family member were at our hospital, you end up spending a few weeks there, you connect with the chaplain. If that were a chaplain who actually also lives and maybe has another call, in the community, and you are able to stay in touch during a rehab process of somebody who was in an accident or a chronic health issues that you have to deal with your teenager or your spouse, I would think there's some great benefits if you have made a good connection. And that person stays with you, again, journeys with you, not just these 2 weeks when you're in the hospital, but over a longer period of time. So how to develop that and navigate that, that's, right now we have more questions, than answers, and how to do that systematically, but that's something we're tapping into, exploring.
So let's close on this. I teach here in health management and policy. We're training young folks to become healthcare administrators. what is the most important thing that they should understand about the role of the chaplain and the chaplaincy in a hospital or other healthcare organization?
I feel really blessed that our leaders in our organization, who I know some of them closer than others, of course, have a very good grasp that chaplains, as somebody who, again, journey with people, do have a strong impact on the overall experience of a person while how they're cared for, overall in the hospital. I think ideally then a leader also, whether they're religious or their faith or they have a sense of spirituality, independent of that they have a sense that chaplains also represent somewhat the spirit of the organization. That chaplains in some ways, embody the mission and the values. That was especially strong when I worked, in a Catholic healthcare, faith-based setting where, the mission and spiritual care is one on the same person. In an academic teaching hospital, the values are somewhat different, more scientific-based, and maybe spirituality doesn't come to the forefront right away, but I think a leader sensing, the opportunity a chaplain has to engage individual patients and their families kind of at their core existential needs, but also the core existential needs of the organization and the people who work there, and that there's great value in that. And there's some freedom with the chaplaincy role because we're less productivity driven, than others, since we're not revenue generating and we're not charging people, for a prayer and a listening ear here, there. I think effective leaders sense that and say, yes, this is of great value to our organization. And if they ask us, to provide maybe some of the data and more details, I think that's okay too. And that's a challenge, that I would, as a manager or director of a department, bring back to the team and say, yes, we want to be accountable and we want to demonstrate by patient stories and maybe systemically how we are making a difference. That is our task, and I think we have the responsibility and communicate that better. Case by case, one situation at a time, or maybe through research, more systemically.
Thank you so much for your time today. This has been really enlightening.
It's been wonderful to review my own kind of vocational journey. It's been quite a few years, and also an impetus, to keep on learning and growing and serving. So thanks for reflecting on where I've been and how far I've come and the work that's still left to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Health Leader Forge, a joint production of the College of Health and Human Services at the University of New Hampshire and the Northern New England Association of Healthcare Executives. Please go to our website, healthleaderforge.org, for more information or to leave comments about today's podcast. Look for Health Leader Forge podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and other podcast distribution sites. Thanks for being a part of the Health Leader Forge community, and we'll talk with you again in about 2 weeks.